In 2004, police in Mississippi made a discovery they would never forget. A freezer, tucked away in a small house, holding the dismembered bodies of two people. The person behind it all? A young woman named Lisa Jo Chamberlain. When we think of the most dangerous criminals, most people picture men. But behind the walls of America's prisons, there are women who have committed crimes so brutal they rival the worst of them. Stick with us as we unravel how these cases began and the twisted paths that led them here. But before we start, quickly tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Are you in bed with the lights off, driving home from work, or maybe halfway across the world starting your day? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how these stories reach people everywhere. And don't forget to subscribe, because this is only the beginning. Lisa Jo Chamberlain, March 2004, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Police were called to a modest home on the outskirts of town. Inside, nothing looked immediately unusual, just an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. But when they opened a freezer in the garage, they found something no one could have imagined: the dismembered remains of two people who were supposed to be alive and well. The person at the center of it all? A 29-year-old woman named Lisa Jo Chamberlain, the only woman now on Mississippi's death row. To those who knew her casually, Lisa didn't stand out. She had grown up in Kansas, a life marked by instability and a string of difficult relationships. Friends described her as someone who could be charming when she wanted to be, funny, talkative, even magnetic at times. But underneath, there was volatility, a restless energy, a history of strained family ties, and a tendency to fall into destructive dynamics with the people closest to her. When she moved to Mississippi with her boyfriend Roger Gillette, it was supposed to be a fresh start. They were young, ambitious in their own way, and trying to carve out something better. But within weeks, that dream turned into something far darker. The victims were Vernon "Buddy" Hewlett and his girlfriend, Linda Heinzelman. Buddy was Roger's uncle, a man who had allowed the couple to stay at his house while they got on their feet. Linda, quiet and kind, worked hard to keep the household running smoothly. At first, it seemed like an act of generosity, family helping family, but as days passed, tension built. Buddy and Linda reportedly grew frustrated with Lisa and Roger's behavior, their lack of work, their arguments, the sense that their presence was becoming more burden than blessing, and for Lisa and Roger, resentment began to fester. What happened next is pieced together through court records and testimony. In early March, an argument erupted in the house. Police later testified that Lisa and Roger decided they would take care of the problem. What followed was a series of violent acts that ended Buddy and Linda's lives inside the very home where they had once felt safe. The details of how it happened were chilling. After the couple was unalived, Lisa and Roger dismembered the bodies, methodically placing the parts in a deep freezer in the garage. They then cleaned the house, attempting to erase any signs of what had occurred. For several days, that freezer held not just evidence, but the weight of two stolen lives. Why did it happen? Prosecutors argued it was about greed and control. Buddy and Linda had possessions the couple wanted: money, property, and the promise of starting over somewhere else. There were also layers of resentment. Lisa, by several accounts, felt disrespected and unwanted, a feeling she had carried for much of her life. But psychologists who studied the case suggested something deeper. Lisa wasn't simply following Roger. She played an active role. Witnesses described her as manipulative, capable of switching between affection and cruelty in ways that kept those around her off balance. And in the days after the crime, she reportedly helped load the freezer into a truck as if it were just another household item. The crime might have gone unnoticed for longer if not for one critical mistake. After the killings, Lisa and Roger fled to Kansas, taking the freezer with them. They planned to sell Buddy's possessions and start over. But neighbors grew suspicious, and when authorities began tracking the missing couple, the trail led straight back to the freezer they had transported across state lines. When investigators finally opened it, the truth was undeniable. Inside were the remains of Buddy Hewlett and Linda Heinzelman, packed in bags. It was a discovery that stunned even seasoned officers. In 2006, Lisa Jo Chamberlain stood trial for capital murder. The prosecution argued that she was not only complicit, but deeply involved in planning and executing the crime. Witnesses recalled her demeanor in the days following the killings, calm, even lighthearted at times. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict her. She was sentenced to death, the first woman in Mississippi to receive that sentence in over 50 years. Roger Gillett was also sentenced to death in a separate trial. Today, Lisa remains on death row at the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility in Pearl. Her appeals have focused on procedural issues and claims of ineffective counsel, but her sentence stands. If carried out, she would become the first woman executed in the state in the modern era. The story of Lisa Jo Chamberlain is a reminder that evil doesn't always come with warning signs. To Buddy and Linda, she was family, a young woman down on her luck, someone they believed they were helping. To the outside world, she might have seemed troubled but harmless. But behind closed doors, resentment, greed, and manipulation built toward an irreversible act of violence. 2 people extended their home in kindness. They paid with their lives. And now, nearly 2 decades later, the echoes of what happened in that Mississippi house remain frozen in memory, much like the grim discovery that brought it all to light. Kathy Wood, Gwendolyn Graham. In 1988, police in Walker, Michigan, uncovered a confession that would change everything they thought they knew about a quiet suburban nursing home. Alpine Manor was supposed to be a place of care, a place where the elderly spent their last days in peace. But behind its sterile walls, a series of deaths that had seemed natural were anything but. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't neglect. It was deliberate. And the truth came from one of their own. Kathy Wood and Gwendolyn Graham didn't look like killers. Kathy, 26, was reserved and quick-witted, often seen with a polite smile and a sense of control that made her seem dependable. She'd been described as intelligent, someone who understood how to read people and situations with unsettling accuracy. Gwen, just a year older, had a different presence, athletic, lively, and charismatic. She was the kind of nurse's aide who could make residents laugh, lifting their spirits as easily as she lifted their frail bodies. To their colleagues, they were simply co-workers. To residents, they were caretakers. To each other, they were more. A romantic relationship that began as intense and intoxicating but quickly turned manipulative and destructive. The women they targeted were some of the most vulnerable in the facility. Their victims included 97-year-old Marguerite Chambers, 72-year-old Minnie Ruse, and 3 others. Women whose names rarely make headlines, but whose lives mattered deeply to their families. These residents trusted Kathy and Gwen to care for them. They depended on them for the most basic of needs: food, hygiene, and safety. But for Kathy and Gwen, these women became something else entirely. They weren't patients. They were pieces in a game. The killings began quietly in early 1987. According to Kathy's later testimony, Gwen smothered the first victim with a washcloth pillow, pressing down until the woman stopped breathing. Kathy claimed she stood watch at the door, ensuring no one would interrupt. The deaths went unnoticed. After all, in a nursing home, death is not unexpected. For staff, the paperwork was routine, the grief subdued by familiarity, and that invisibility gave them confidence. One by one, they selected more victims, each attack carefully timed to coincide with low traffic hours. Kathy later said Gwen wanted to spell out the word murder using the first letters of each victim's last name. Whether this was truly their intention or a story Kathy told to frame the narrative, investigators could never confirm, but it gave a chilling glimpse into how they may have tried to make sense of their actions, giving chaos a pattern, giving cruelty a purpose. What drove them? Some psychologists believe it was less about the victims and more about each other. Kathy often portrayed herself as the submissive partner, someone coerced by Gwen's stronger will. But her personality suggested something more complex. She was manipulative, skilled at controlling how others perceived her. Gwen, by contrast, craved dominance, but seemed easier to influence than she realized. Their relationship was volatile, swinging between passion and resentment. Power shifted constantly, and the killings may have served as a twisted way to bind them together, a shared secret that no one else could touch. Taru. The murders might have remained hidden if not for the collapse of their relationship. By late 1987, Gwen had grown distant, eventually moving to Texas to start over. Kathy, now alone, began to talk. She first confided in her ex-husband, describing the crimes in unsettling detail. At first, he didn't believe her, but as her stories grew more consistent and more disturbing, he went to police. In early 1988, detectives began their investigation. With no physical evidence, they relied on Kathy's account, corroborated by co-workers who remembered strange conversations. Jokes about suffocating patients, boasts about how easy it was to take a life without being caught. Finally, Kathy struck a deal. In exchange for her testimony against Gwen, she would receive a reduced sentence. Gwen, arrested in Texas and brought back to Michigan, denied everything. But Kathy's testimony, along with the weight of circumstantial evidence, was enough. In 1989, Gwendolyn Graham was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree unaliving and 1 count of conspiracy. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She remains incarcerated at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan, serving multiple life terms. Kathy Wood, despite her role in planning and covering up the crimes, was sentenced to 20 to 40 years for second-degree unaliving and conspiracy. She was sent to the Robert Scott Correctional Facility, later moved to the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility as well. Her eligibility for parole has been a point of controversy, with victims' families arguing she should never be released. The Alpine Manor case forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Danger can hide in plain sight. The women who took these lives weren't strangers breaking in from the outside. They were the very people entrusted to provide care, to offer dignity and tea. The most vulnerable moments of life. 5 women spent their final moments not in comfort, but in fear they could not express, their voices silenced in the very place meant to protect them. Kathy Wood and Gwendolyn Graham's names are remembered for what they destroyed, but it's the names of their victims, Marguerite, Minnie, and the others, that deserve to be carried forward, because behind every headline about killers are the quiet stories of those who should have been safe and weren't. Antoinette Frank, March 4, 1995, New Orleans, Louisiana. It was just after midnight at the Kimon Vietnamese restaurant, a family-run spot that stayed open late to serve police officers and locals. The streets outside were quiet, but inside, terror unfolded. When officers responded to a frantic call, they found 3 people unalived: restaurant owner Ha Vu and her 2 children, 17-year-old Quang and 24-year-old Ha. Among the bodies was a young police officer, Ronnie Williams, shot in uniform while working a security detail. And the name that surfaced as a suspect shocked even seasoned detectives, one of their own, Officer Antoinette Frank. Antoinette wasn't the type of officer you'd expect to see accused of such a crime. She joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1993, one of the youngest women in her class. She'd come from a troubled background, stories of instability and alleged abuse, but on the surface she appeared determined to make something of herself. To colleagues, she seemed eager, even idealistic. She'd talk about wanting to serve her community. To the Vu family, she was more than just a regular officer. She was a familiar face. She ate meals at their restaurant, joked with the staff, and even struck up a friendship with them. But behind that uniform was a side of Antoinette most people never saw, an impulsive, unpredictable personality, and a deep financial desperation that would turn deadly. The Vu family trusted her. They often let her eat for free. Ha Vu, the mother, even treated her like a niece. Officer Ronnie Williams, too, saw Antoinette as a colleague, someone who had his back when patrolling a dangerous city. But trust can be a dangerous thing. And in March 1995, that trust was shattered. Antoinette wasn't alone that night. She had brought along her boyfriend, 18-year-old Rogers Lacaze, a man with a reputation for violence and a crim. Enel passed. Together, they walked into the Kim On restaurant carrying a plan that would leave 4 people dead. The timeline of that night is chilling. Antoinette and Lacaze had visited the restaurant earlier in the evening, sharing food with the family and chatting as if everything was normal. Witnesses later said there was no sign of tension, nothing to suggest what would come next. But shortly after midnight, they returned, this time armed. According to surviving witnesses, they forced their way inside. Officer Ronnie Williams was the first to be shot. He never had a chance to draw his weapon. The Vu children were next, targeted as they tried to flee or hide. Their mother, Ha Vu, was killed last, her body discovered near the kitchen. All of it happened in minutes. Then Antoinette and Lacaze searched the restaurant for cash, stepping around the bodies of people who had once welcomed them as friends. Why did she do it? The prosecution argued it was about money. Antoinette was drowning in debt. Her salary as a new officer couldn't cover her expenses, and she was allegedly funneling money to Lacaze, who was also pressuring her for more. The Kim On restaurant, which often had large amounts of cash on hand, became their target. But there were deeper layers. Psychological evaluations suggested Antoinette exhibited traits of manipulation and impulsivity. Former colleagues described her as sometimes unstable, charming one moment, explosive the next. Some believe she was trying to prove loyalty to Lacaze, to maintain control of a relationship that gave her a sense of power she didn't have elsewhere. Others think she believed her badge would shield her from suspicion, that no one would suspect a police officer of orchestrating such a crime. The case moved quickly. Surviving members of the Vu family told investigators they recognized Lacaze immediately, and when detectives dug deeper, they found a trail of evidence. The pair had been seen together before and after the killings, and ballistic tests linked the bullets to the weapons they carried. But perhaps the most shocking moment came when Antoinette herself returned to the crime scene hours later, posing as a concerned officer. She walked through the restaurant alongside detectives, pointing out details, even asking questions about how such a thing could have happened. For investigators, her behavior raised alarms. By the next day, both Antoinette Frank and Rogers Lacaze were arrested. In 1995, Antoinette stood trial for 3 counts of first-degree unaliving. The courtroom was packed. Officers, community members, and the Vu family all staring at the young woman in uniform accused of betraying everything she represented. The evidence was overwhelming: eyewitness testimony, ballistics, and her own inconsistent statements. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before finding her guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to death. Lacaze, tried separately, also received a death sentence. Both remain on Louisiana's death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola. The story of Antoinette Frank is not just the story of a crime. It's the story of broken trust, a family who offered kindness paid with their lives. A fellow officer, standing watch to protect them, never went home. And a city already struggling with corruption and violence saw one of its protectors become a predator. For the Vu family, the Kim On restaurant was more than a business. It was a dream built through hard work and sacrifice. For Ronnie Williams, that late-night security shift was another step in a career of service. Today, Antoinette Frank sits on death row, awaiting an end she brought upon herself. Her badge, once a symbol of duty, has become a reminder of how power, when twisted by greed and fear, can destroy everything it's meant to defend. Dana Sue Gray, February 28, 1994. Canyon Lake, California. The gated community was the kind of place where residents felt insulated from danger. Quiet streets, manicured lawns, neighbors who waved as they passed. That illusion shattered when police found the body of 86-year-old Norma Davis inside her home. At first glance, it looked like a burglary gone wrong. But as investigators dug deeper, they realized this was no random attack. It was the beginning of a series of crimes that would terrify Riverside County, all tied to one woman, Dana Sue Gray. Dana Gray didn't fit the image of a killer. She was a 36-year-old nurse, blonde and charismatic, with a taste for expensive clothes and designer labels. To her friends, she seemed ambitious, even glamorous. Someone who loved the finer things in life and didn't hide it. But beneath the surface was financial chaos. Dana was drowning in debt. Her credit cards maxed out, her lifestyle far exceeding her income. After a turbulent childhood marked by family instability and a failed marriage that left her bitter, Dana's life had become a pattern of compulsive spending and escalating desperation. Her victims were women who trusted her. They were elderly, living alone, and accustomed to kindness from younger neighbors and caregivers. Norma Davis, the first victim, was the mother-in-law of one of Dana's friends, a woman who had once welcomed Dana into her home. The second victim, 66-year-old June Roberts, knew Dana casually and thought nothing of letting her inside when she showed up on her doorstep. The third, 87-year-old Dora Beebe, had crossed paths with Dana at a local beauty shop, where she seemed polite, even friendly. In each case, Dana used familiarity and charm as her way in, and once inside, she turned on them. Norma Davis was found strangled and stabbed in her Canyon Lake home. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting she'd willingly let her killer in. Detectives were puzzled by the overkill, marks of rage that didn't align with a typical burglary. Just weeks later, June Roberts was discovered dead in her house. Missing were her credit cards, which investigators traced to a spree of purchases, designer clothes, jewelry, and salon visits. The boldness of it stood out. Whoever did this wasn't hiding. They were flaunting the rewards. On March 16th, Dana struck again. Dora Beebe was found murdered in her Menifee home, her body showing signs of a struggle. Within hours of her death, someone used her credit cards to buy more luxury items. The pattern was clear: murder followed by shopping. Detectives realized they weren't just hunting a killer. They were chasing someone who believed she deserved the spoils. What drove Dana Sue Gray? Psychologists later described her crimes as hedonistic, rooted in a compulsive need for gratification. Unlike many killers, Dana didn't seek control or revenge. She sought pleasure. The rush of shopping wasn't just about material gain, it was about erasing, even for a moment, the emptiness she carried inside. Friends recalled how Dana had grown obsessed with appearances after her divorce. She wanted to project success, to look like someone who had it all, even as her life spiraled financially. Her job as a nurse gave her access to vulnerable people and the confidence to manipulate trust. In interviews, Dana admitted she believed her victims wouldn't fight back. To her, they weren't just targets. They were stepping stones to maintain the illusion she couldn't live without. Detectives pieced the case together through credit card records and eyewitness accounts. Store employees remembered Dana vividly, laughing, trying on outfits, her arms full of purchases paid for with her victims' cards. Surveillance cameras captured her casually swiping the stolen credit. The final break came when a witness saw Dana leaving Dora Beebe's neighborhood on the day of the murder. Combined with the financial trail, it was enough for a warrant. On March 17, 1994, police arrested Dana at her boyfriend's house. She didn't resist. In fact, she seemed detached, as though she didn't fully grasp the gravity of what she had done. When confronted with evidence, she confessed, though her explanations remained chillingly shallow. She wanted money, she wanted things, and killing was the fastest way to get them. In 1998, Dana Sue Gray avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to 3 counts of first-degree unaliving. Prosecutors agreed to the deal partly to spare the victims' families from reliving the details through a lengthy trial. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole and sent to the California Women's Prison in Chowchilla, where she remains today. Even behind bars, Dana's fascination with appearance hasn't disappeared. Prison staff have noted her focus on grooming and image, as though she's still trying to project control in a life where she has none. The murders of Norma Davis, June Roberts, and Dora Beebe weren't just about greed. They were about a void that could never be filled, a hunger so consuming that even human life became secondary to desire. Dana Sue Gray entered her victims' homes as someone they trusted, someone they believed meant no harm. In return for their kindness, she took their lives and used their deaths to dress herself in the illusion of success. Today, she sits in prison, her shopping sprees replaced by a concrete cell. The things she killed for are long gone, but the impact of what she did remains, echoing through the lives of families who lost mothers and grandmothers to her need for more. Patricia Krenwinkel, August 10, 1969, Los Angeles, California. In the quiet Los Feliz neighborhood, the home of supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary stood as a picture of middle-class stability. That Sunday morning, their neighbors noticed nothing unusual. By the next day, police would enter the house to find a scene so horrific it would mark a turning point in American culture. The LaBiancas had been brutally unalived in their own home. Among those responsible was a 21-year-old woman who, until months earlier, had been described as shy, soft-spoken, and eager to please. Her name was Patricia Krenwinkel. To anyone who knew her before the crimes, Patricia didn't stand out. Born in Los Angeles in 1947, she grew up in what seemed like an ordinary household. Friends remembered her as quiet, self-conscious, and often withdrawn. She sang in her church choir. She babysat for neighbors. She had dreams of becoming a secretary or maybe a teacher. But beneath her mild demeanor was a deep sense of inadequacy. Patricia struggled with self-esteem, convinced she was unwanted and unlovable. By the late 1960s, that vulnerability made her a perfect target for someone like Charles Manson, a man who offered her what she thought she'd never have: acceptance, purpose, and love. Patricia didn't know the LaBiancas. To her, they were strangers, people she and the other family members had never met until that night. But in Manson's worldview, the LaBiancas were symbols. He told his followers that killing them would ignite chaos, part of his delusion of a coming race war he called helter-skelter. For Patricia, obedience had become her identity. She wasn't acting out of personal hatred. She was acting out of devotion to the man who had convinced her she finally mattered. On the evening of August 9, 1969, Patricia participated in the infamous Tate murders. Years later, she and several others returned to Spahn Ranch, where Manson decided they hadn't gone far enough. He chose a new target, the LaBianca home. That night, Manson himself entered the house first, tying up Leno and Rosemary and reassuring them they wouldn't be harmed. Then he sent Patricia and the others inside with a different order, to finish what they had started. According to testimony, Patricia stabbed Rosemary repeatedly while another member attacked Leno. Afterward, they used the couple's blood to scrawl messages on the walls, symbols of Manson's apocalyptic vision. Patricia would later say she felt as though she had surrendered her will entirely, her actions mechanical, her sense of morality erased by the cult's control. How does someone like Patricia Krenwinkel become capable of such violence? Experts who studied her described a pattern common in cult dynamics: isolation, manipulation, and dependency. Manson targeted individuals who were emotionally vulnerable and taught them to reject their former identities. To gain his approval, they had to abandon empathy, seeing themselves as soldiers in a larger mission. For Patricia, who had grown up believing she had no voice, Manson's control felt like liberation. "I thought he was God," she later admitted in interviews from prison. Over time, that belief justified anything he asked of her, no matter how horrific. But once she was arrested and separated from Manson's influence, reality began to return. She confessed she had been consumed by shame and disbelief at what she'd done, calling it the ultimate betrayal of everything I ever wanted to be. The Manson family arrests came quickly. By late 1969, detectives had linked the LaBianca and Tate murders through physical evidence and confessions from former followers. Patricia was captured in Alabama, where she had fled after the crimes, hoping to disappear into her old life. Her trial in 1970 was unlike anything the country had seen. Manson turned it into a spectacle, carving an X into his forehead and demanding his followers do the same. Patricia complied, smiling and singing in court alongside the other women, as though still under his spell. The jury found her guilty of 7 counts of first-degree unaliving. She was sentenced to death in 1971, a sentence later commuted to life in prison when California temporarily abolished the death penalty. Patricia Krenwinkel has now spent more than 5 decades behind bars, the longest-serving woman in California's prison system. Over time, she became known for her exemplary behavior, mentoring younger inmates and working in programs for abused women. She earned college degrees and publicly expressed remorse, stating repeatedly that she takes full responsibility for her actions. Despite these changes, her parole has been denied 14 times. The families of her victims consistently oppose her release, arguing that no amount of good behavior can erase the devastation of her crimes. Today, she is housed at the California Institution for Women in Chino, serving life without parole unless future legal changes intervene. The story of Patricia Krenwinkel is both horrifying and tragic. She entered the LaBianca home that night as an agent of someone else's vision, but the choices she made were her own. The lives she took, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, were irreplaceable, their futures stolen in the name of a delusion. Patricia once said that the hardest part of living in prison is knowing she can never undo what she's done. Her transformation over decades behind bars may be genuine, but it exists alongside a legacy of violence that will never fade. For the LaBianca family, justice has meant keeping her there. For Patricia, justice has meant waking up every day to remember the people whose lives she ended, and carrying the weight of being both victim and perpetrator of Charles Manson's control. Rita Mays, Clarksburg, West Virginia, summer of 2018. The Louis A. Johnson VA Medical Center had long been a place where military veterans came for care in their final years, a quiet hospital where staff were trusted to safeguard those who had already sacrificed so much. But over a span of months, something was terribly wrong. Patients who had been stable began dying suddenly without clear explanation. And it wasn't until families pressed for answers that investigators uncovered a truth no one wanted to believe. Someone inside the hospital had been systematically ending lives. At the center of it was a nursing assistant named Rita Mays. To most people, Rita looked ordinary. She was 46 years old, a mother and grandmother, and had served briefly in the Army National Guard. Her social media showed photos of family trips, pets, and ordinary days in rural West Virginia. Colleagues described her as quiet, sometimes even shy. She had no criminal record, no history of violence. When she started working at the VA hospital in 2015, her job was to provide basic care, changing linens, checking vital signs, and offering comfort to aging veterans. She wasn't licensed to administer medication. She wasn't supposed to touch insulin at all. But behind her calm demeanor was a decision that would transform her from caregiver to predator. Her victims were men who had survived wars only to lose their lives in a hospital bed. They were between 81 and 96 years old, fathers, grandfathers, soldiers who had served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. They had come to the VA for recovery or long-term care, trusting that the staff around them would keep them safe. Many of them never knew what was happening. Families thought they were improving. Doctors expected they would be discharged soon. Instead, they died suddenly, their blood sugar catastrophically low, a symptom no one could explain at the time. The killings began quietly. Between July 2017 and June 2018, Rita Mays injected at least 7 veterans with unnecessary doses of insulin, often in the late-night hours of her shifts. She would then watch as their conditions deteriorated. Medical staff struggled to make sense of it. Some patients had no history of diabetes, no reason to receive insulin at all. But insulin metabolizes quickly, leaving little forensic evidence. For months, the pattern went undetected. It wasn't until 2 families demanded autopsies that suspicion sharpened. The results revealed dangerously low blood sugar levels consistent with insulin overdose. When investigators reviewed hospital logs and surveillance footage, a troubling pattern emerged. Rita Mays had been on duty for every suspicious death. Why would a nursing assistant, someone entrusted with care, do this? Rita never gave a clear answer. In interviews, she claimed she had been struggling with stress, nightmares, and mental health issues linked to her military service, though she had never seen combat. Prosecutors argued she was seeking a twisted sense of control, deciding who lived and who died. Psychologists described her actions as a form of angel of death behavior, a phenomenon where caregivers harm those they are supposed to protect, often under the guise of mercy or curiosity. But Rita admitted her victims weren't suffering. Many were getting better. She wasn't ending pain, she was creating it. Perhaps the most chilling detail was her behavior after the deaths. She didn't distance herself. She attended memorial services, spoke kindly to grieving families, and expressed sympathy for their loss, all while knowing she had caused it. By 2018, the evidence was overwhelming. Federal investigators interviewed staff, analyzed medication records, and confirmed that insulin doses had been accessed outside protocol. When confronted, Rita initially denied involvement, but later admitted responsibility for 7 deaths and 1 attempted killing. In July 2020, she pleaded guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder. During her sentencing hearing, she apologized, saying she struggled to understand her own actions. Families of the victims described her apology as hollow, pointing out that her choices had robbed them of time they could never get back. The court sentenced Rita Mays to 7 consecutive life terms, plus an additional 20 years. She is serving her sentence at Federal Medical Center, Carswell, a facility in Texas that houses female inmates with specialized medical needs. For the families of the veterans, the sentence offered some closure but not peace. They had trusted the VA to care for their loved ones. That trust had been broken in the most devastating way possible. The story of Rita Mays is a story of betrayal. The men she killed had faced the dangers of war and returned home believing they were safe. They had survived battles overseas only to fall victim to someone they thought was helping them. In court, one family member said, "We sent our fathers to the VA to be cared for, not to be executed." Those words still hang heavy over the hospital in Clarksburg, where new safety measures have been put in place, but where memories of what happened linger. For Rita Mays, life now means confinement, her freedom gone just as she stole it from others. For the families, life means remembering their loved ones not for the way they died, but for the lives they lived, the service they gave, and the care they deserved, but never received. Vicki Dawn Jackson, Nocona, Texas. Early 2001. Nocona General Hospital served a small, tight-knit community. It was the kind of place where everyone knew the nurses by name and trusted them without question. Patients came here to heal, often cared for by the same faces they'd known for years. But between December 2000 and February 2001, something deeply unsettling began to unfold. 10 patients, ranging in age from 61 to 88, died unexpectedly. They weren't terminal. Many had been showing signs of recovery. It would take months of quiet suspicion and painstaking investigation before authorities identified the pattern, and at the center of it was a nurse named Vicki Dawn Jackson. On the surface, Vicki didn't seem remarkable. She was 36 years old, a mother of 2, and had spent most of her career in small-town hospitals across Texas. Co-workers described her as competent, sometimes cheerful, sometimes moody. Nothing out of the ordinary for someone working long shifts in a demanding job. Patients often said she was gentle. She had a reassuring bedside manner, the kind people trusted. In a town like Nocona, that mattered. Nurses weren't just employees. They were neighbors, friends, and in many cases lifelines. But behind that image was a growing darkness, one that no one suspected until it was too late. Her victims were people who had placed their lives in her hands. Some were recovering from surgeries, others were being treated for manageable illnesses. They were parents, grandparents, and community members who had lived through decades of hardship and joy, never imagining their final moments would come not from illness, but from someone they trusted to care for them. There was no obvious connection between the patients beyond their shared vulnerability and their access to Vicki during her shifts. The deaths came quickly, one after another. Hospital staff first noticed the pattern in late 2000, when otherwise stable patients began to experience sudden catastrophic respiratory failure. Resuscitation efforts often failed, and autopsies provided no clear explanation. Behind the scenes, Vicki was quietly introducing a lethal agent into their systems, a paralytic drug called Mivacron, intended for use in controlled surgical settings to temporarily stop breathing so that patients could be placed on ventilators. Used improperly, it causes near-instant respiratory arrest. Vicky had access to the hospital's supply and administered it without authorization, leaving no immediate trace. The drug metabolized quickly, making it difficult to detect in toxicology tests. Colleagues later recalled how she seemed calm, even detached during the codes, sometimes offering help, sometimes standing back and watching events unfold. One nurse remembered her saying, almost casually, "They're better off this way," though no one understood what she meant at the time. Why would a nurse, a caregiver, do this? Prosecutors struggled to establish a clear motive. Some believed Vicky was seeking control, playing out a power over life and death dynamic often seen in medical serial killers. Others speculated she was driven by resentment, having expressed frustrations with hospital management and patient care demands. Her personal life added complexity. She was going through a divorce, and friends described her as under strain, sometimes volatile. But none of it explained why she targeted patients who posed no threat to her. Psychologists later suggested her actions aligned with a rare but documented phenomenon: medical professionals who commit what's called medical homicide, often seeking emotional gratification from orchestrating crises or positioning themselves as responders. But Vicky didn't save her patients. She didn't try to reverse the outcome she caused. She simply let them die. For months, suspicion grew quietly. Hospital administrators initially thought the spike in deaths might be a coincidence, linked to flu season or underlying health conditions. But the patterns were too precise: the timing, the suddenness, and the fact that most incidents occurred during Vicky's shifts. In early 2001, pharmacy records revealed discrepancies in the hospital's supply of Mivacron. Vials were missing, and sign-out sheets had been altered or left blank. Investigators exhumed 2 bodies and found trace evidence of the drug, confirming what many had feared. The deaths were intentional. Vicky was arrested in July 2002. Her demeanor, according to those present, was flat, neither surprised nor defiant. She offered little explanation, only insisting that she hadn't meant to hurt anyone, a claim starkly at odds with the evidence. Her trial in 2006 focused on 2 representative cases out of the 10 confirmed deaths. The state presented evidence of the drug thefts, medical records, and testimony from staff who had begun to fear her presence on the ward. A chilling piece of evidence was her own statement to a colleague, reportedly saying she could make people stop breathing if she wanted to. After deliberation, the jury found her guilty of capital murder. Rather than seeking the death penalty, prosecutors accepted a sentence that would ensure she would never walk free, life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 40 years. She was sent to the Mountain View Unit, a maximum security prison for women in Gatesville, Texas. Her parole eligibility date is 2042, when she will be in her late 70s. The case of Vicky Dawn Jackson leaves behind haunting questions. In small towns, trust is the glue that holds communities together. Patients believed that trust extended to their caregivers, that a hospital bed was a place of healing, not harm. Vicky violated that trust in the most profound way possible, turning a sanctuary into a site of fear. For the families of her victims, justice feels incomplete. No sentence can return the time they lost. The final moments they imagined would be peaceful, but instead were stolen. Today, Vicky sits in her cell at Mountain View, her name etched into the history of medical crimes, a reminder that danger can sometimes come not from strangers, but from those we rely on most. And in Nocona, the hospital still stands, its staff working to rebuild trust in a place forever marked by what happened there. Celeste Beard, October 2nd, 1999, Austin, Texas. At first glance, it looked like a botched robbery. Steve Beard, a 62-year-old self-made millionaire, was found gravely injured in his upscale suburban home. He'd been shot while sleeping in his bed. Neighbors were stunned. Steve wasn't the kind of man to have enemies. He'd built his fortune through hard work, was known for his generosity, and seemed to have settled into a comfortable life in retirement. But this was no random act. Over the next few months, as Steve struggled in the hospital, detectives began to untangle a story that was far darker and more calculated than it first appeared. And at the center of it all was his wife, Celeste Beard. Celeste was 32 when she married Steve, a striking contrast to his 62. To outsiders, their relationship was easy to stereotype, the wealthy older man and the beautiful younger wife. But those who knew them said Celeste was more than just charming. She was magnetic. She could light up a room with her presence, and Steve, who had been widowed, seemed enchanted by her energy. Celeste had grown up in Texas, living through a difficult childhood marked by instability and a deep need for security. By the late 1990s, she had what she seemed to always want: a sprawling mansion, luxury cars, designer clothes, and the status of being married to one of the most successful men in Austin. But beneath that polished exterior was a woman who wasn't satisfied, and a man who didn't realize just how dangerous that dissatisfaction would become. Steve loved Celeste deeply. Friends said he doted on her, often going out of his way to give her everything she asked for. But in private, their marriage was strained. Celeste was known to have mood swings, and she reportedly told friends she felt trapped by the marriage despite enjoying the wealth it brought her. To Celeste, Steve was both her provider and her obstacle. He gave her the life she wanted, but she didn't want him in it anymore. And that duality, dependency mixed with resentment, would become the foundation for what happened next. The shooting took place while Steve was asleep. He survived the initial attack but endured months of surgeries and complications. He told investigators he didn't know who could have done it, though he seemed to sense there was something off in his marriage. The investigation took a turn when police learned about Tracy Tarleton, a woman Celeste had met during her time in a mental health treatment program. Tracy had developed an intense infatuation with Celeste, believing they shared a romantic connection. According to Tracy, Celeste fueled this obsession, convincing her that Steve was abusive and that the only way they could be together was if Steve was gone. On the night of the shooting, Tracy admitted she entered the Beard residence with a shotgun and fired at Steve as he slept. But she insisted she hadn't come up with the plan alone. She claimed Celeste orchestrated the entire thing. The more investigators learned about Celeste, the more complex she appeared. She wasn't the image of the desperate spouse seeking escape. She was someone who thrived on control. Celeste carefully managed how people perceived her. To Steve, she was the loving wife. To friends, she painted herself as a victim in need of rescuing. And to Tracy, she played the role of the soulmate trapped in an unbearable marriage. But her motive was straightforward: money. Under Steve's will, Celeste stood to inherit his multi-million-dollar estate if he died while they were still married. Divorcing him would mean walking away with far less. Psychologists later described her behavior as manipulative and calculating, someone skilled at exploiting the emotional vulnerabilities of others. Tracy's obsession wasn't an accident. It was the product of months of careful psychological grooming by Celeste, who dangled promises of a future together while setting Tracy up to carry out the crime. Steve Beard died of complications from his injuries in January 2000. By then, investigators had enough evidence to charge both Tracy and Celeste. Tracy accepted a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Celeste, detailing how Celeste encouraged her to kill Steve and assured her they would live happily ever after once he was gone. Celeste's defense team argued that Tracy acted alone, driven by unrequited love and jealousy. But prosecutors presented phone records, financial documents, and witness testimony painting a different picture: a woman who manipulated everyone around her to get what she wanted. In 2003, Celeste Beard was found guilty of capital murder. The jury sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Today, Celeste Beard is incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit, a maximum security prison in Gatesville, Texas. She maintains her innocence, insisting she had nothing to do with her husband's death. Her daughters, who initially supported her, have since distanced themselves, some publicly stating they believe she played a role in their father's murder. Celeste will be eligible for parole around 2042, at which point she will be in her late 70s. The case of Celeste Beard is a chilling reminder of how appearances can deceive. To the world, she seemed to have everything: wealth, status, and a husband who adored her. But beneath that life of privilege was a hunger for more, a hunger so consuming that it destroyed the very person who gave her everything she had. For Steve Beard, love was an act of generosity. For Celeste, love was a transaction. And for Tracy Tarleton, love became a weapon she was convinced to wield. In the end, 3 lives were shattered: Steve's, Tracy's, and Celeste's. And while Celeste now sits behind bars, the echoes of her choices still ripple outward, through the family that lost a father, the community that lost its sense of trust, and the unsettling realization that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers, but from the person sleeping beside you. Susan Atkins, August 9, 1969, Los Angeles, California. In the Benedict Canyon neighborhood, a sprawling estate sat tucked away behind private gates. That night, it was filled with laughter, music, and the easy rhythm of summer. Actress Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, was at home with friends. None of them could have imagined what was coming. By morning, the house would become the site of one of the most infamous crimes in American history, and among those responsible was a young woman named Susan Atkins, a woman who, just a few years earlier, had been dreaming of a better life. To the outside world, Susan Atkins didn't seem destined for violence. Born in 1948 in Northern California, she grew up shy, often described as sweet-natured, but deeply insecure. Her childhood was marked by instability. Her mother died of cancer when Susan was 15, and her father, overwhelmed by grief, began to drift away from the family. As a teenager, Susan wanted what many young women wanted: belonging, love, and a sense of purpose. She sang in her school choir, dreamed of being a performer, and hoped one day she'd find someone who truly saw her. But by her late teens, she was drifting, working odd jobs, falling in with the wrong crowds, and searching for something that felt meaningful. Susan had no personal connection to Sharon Tate or her friends. They were strangers to her, symbols rather than people. In the twisted ideology of Charles Manson, the people in that house represented the wealth and privilege he believed had denied him the success he deserved. For Susan, who had fallen under Manson's control, the victims were simply part of what she had been told was a necessary mission. In her mind, she wasn't attacking individuals. She believed she was carrying out a larger plan. That belief would become her undoing. Susan met Charles Manson in 1967. At the time, she was living in San Francisco, working as a topless dancer. When she encountered Manson, she described him as charismatic and almost otherworldly. He promised her love, family, and freedom, a vision of life that felt intoxicating to someone who had always felt invisible. By 1969, Susan had become one of Manson's most devoted followers, living at Spahn Ranch with the so-called family. There, Manson preached about a coming apocalypse he called helter-skelter, a race war he believed he could ignite through a series of brutal crimes. On the night of August 8th, Manson sent Susan, along with Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, to 150 Cielo Drive, the home where Sharon Tate and her friends were staying. What happened next is almost impossible to put into words. Under Tex's direction, they stormed the property, attacking everyone inside. Susan played a direct role in the killings, later admitting she stabbed one of the victims and even boasted about it to others in the days that followed. Her lack of remorse at the time shocked even those around her. How does someone like Susan Atkins transform from a shy, insecure girl into a willing participant in such horror? Experts who later studied her case described a pattern common in cult dynamics. Manson stripped his followers of their identities, convincing them that their worth depended on serving him. He blended fear, manipulation, and a warped sense of destiny, creating an environment where acts of violence felt not only justified, but righteous. For Susan, Manson became a father figure, lover and savior all at once. She believed he saw her in a way no one else ever had. That devotion blinded her to the reality of what she was doing. But once she was arrested and removed from Manson's influence, Susan began to change. In interviews years later, she described feeling overwhelming shame, saying, "I allowed myself to be totally annihilated, and I lost my humanity in the process. Susan Atkins' trial in 1970 was one of the most publicized in history. Alongside Manson and other members of the family, she sat in court, at times smiling and singing, a reflection of how deeply she was still under his spell. She was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder, including the Tate and LaBianca killings, and sentenced to death. In 1972, California briefly abolished the death penalty, and her sentence was commuted to life in prison. Over the decades that followed, Susan underwent a profound transformation. She became a devout Christian, married twice while incarcerated, and expressed deep remorse for her crimes. She also worked with prison outreach programs, attempting to help other inmates turn their lives around. Despite her changes, Susan was repeatedly denied parole. The families of her victims argued that no amount of repentance could undo what she had done, and the California Parole Board agreed. Susan Atkins never left prison. In 2008, she was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. She requested compassionate release, citing her deteriorating health and the fact that she was no longer a danger to society. The request was denied. On September 24, 2009, Susan Atkins died at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She was 61 years old and had spent nearly 40 years behind bars, the longest of any female inmate in California at that time. The story of Susan Atkins is a story of loss on every level. She lost her mother at a young age. She lost her sense of self to a man who promised salvation but delivered destruction. And in the end, she lost her freedom, her future, and her life, all because she allowed herself to be consumed by someone else's vision of the world. For the families of Sharon Tate and the other victims, justice has always been measured by memory, the constant reminder of what was taken from them. For Susan, justice became the weight of living with what she had done, a punishment that no court could ever truly match. She once said in an interview, "I sinned against God and humanity, and no one can ever make it right." Perhaps that's the truest reflection of her story, a life defined not by who she was meant to be, but by the irreversible choice that ensured she could never escape what she became. Each of these women came from different places, lived different lives, and yet they all crossed the same line, the point where choice became destruction and where they now sit behind bars, some for life, some waiting for death, some never leaving those prison walls alive. It's unsettling to realize that the most dangerous people don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they are the people we trust to protect us, heal us, or love us. And maybe that's why these stories stay with us, because they force us to ask how someone becomes capable of such things, and whether we'd ever see it coming if they were standing right in front of us. I'd like to hear what you think. Which of these cases disturbed you the most? And which country's women killers should we cover next? Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are in the comments below. If you found this video valuable, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. It doesn't just help us grow, it helps keep these deep dive investigations possible. Your support makes a real difference in bringing more stories like this to light. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.